If shyness was a sickness, David needed immediate treatment. This boy was not just shy, he was painfully shy. Hello, family. Welcome to Storytime Virtually. Please subscribe and leave a like for us because it means a lot to us, and share this video to your friends and loved ones, and don't forget to turn on post notifications for more videos. Sit back, relax as we dive into the story. In primary school, when teachers asked him to introduce himself, he would sweat like a goat in the sun and whisper his name so softly that even the crickets could barely hear him. In secondary school, when girls greeted him, he would freeze like a statue and forget how to breathe. And now, in university, his condition had gotten worse. David was tall, handsome, and smart, but when it came to talking to girls, he was useless. His best friends, James and Michael, were the complete opposite. These two could talk for Africa. They had the confidence of politicians and the charm of actors, even though they had never actually had girlfriends. David had survived his entire life without ever telling a girl he liked her. But then, something terrible happened. He met Jessica. The first time David saw Jessica, he knew he was in big trouble. She was the kind of girl that could make a shy boy forget his name, his house address, and even the course he was studying. Jessica was beautiful. Not just in a she's pretty kind of way, but in a this girl was specially created by God on a public holiday when he had extra time kind of way. She had dark skin that glowed like fresh palm oil, a bright smile, and always smelled like vanilla. From the moment David saw her, something changed. His heartbeat started playing drums in his chest. His hands became sweaty like someone who just finished eating hot pepper soup. His brain? Completely empty. This was love at first sight, or at least shyness at first sight. And unfortunately for him, his friends noticed immediately. James and Michael were not the kind of friends who would mind their business. The moment they saw David looking at Jessica like a lost puppy, they knew something was going on. James smirked. "David, why are you staring at that girl like that?" Michael grinned. "You like her, don't you?" David immediately denied it. "What? No. I don't even know her." James and Michael exchanged looks. "You don't need to know her to fall in love, my friend," Michael said. "Love doesn't need permission." David sighed. "You guys are not serious." But the problem was his friends were too observant. They saw how David always looked for Jessica whenever they entered a lecture hall. They saw how his mood changed whenever she was around. They saw how he would get extra nervous whenever Jessica walked past. And that was how the teasing began. At first, it was small teasing. "David, your wife is passing?" "David, say hello to your future-in-law." David ignored them, but they refused to stop. Every time Jessica walked past, they made sure she noticed David. One day, during lunch break, Jessica was walking with her friends when James shouted, "Jessica, come and greet your husbands." David choked on his food. Jessica looked around, confused. "Husband? Who?" Michael pointed directly at David. Jessica's eyes landed on him, and for a moment, they made eye contact. David's brain completely shut down. His mouth wanted to say hi, but instead, he only managed to let out a small cough. Jessica frowned in confusion and walked away. David buried his face in his hands. "I hate you guys." James and Michael burst into laughter. After weeks of teasing, James and Michael decided to help David. "David, since you're too scared to talk to her, let us talk to her for you." David's eyes widened in horror. "And oh," he shouted, "you guys will embarrass me." Michael raised an eyebrow. "So you'd rather continue suffering in silence?" David groaned. "I just need time." James rolled his eyes. "Time for what?" "Time for another man to collect hers." David sighed. He knew his friends were right. Every day, he saw confident guys talking to Jessica, making her laugh. And every day, he wished he could do the same. Finally, after months of pressure, David made a decision. He was going to talk to Jessica. James and Michael celebrated like they had just won a lottery. "This is history in the making," James said. Michael nodded. "We need to prepare you for battle." That afternoon, David prepared for the most difficult mission of his life. He practiced in the mirror. He rehearsed different ways to say hi. He even chewed gum to make his voice sound cooler. Then it was time. Jessica was standing near the cafeteria, talking to her friends. David took a deep breath and started walking towards her. Step 1. Don't trip. Step 2. Don't sweat too much. Step 3. Say something normal. He reached her and cleared his throat. Hi, Jessica. Jessica turned around and looked at him. Yes. David felt his confidence drop to zero. His hands were sweating, his legs were shaking, and his heartbeat was playing drums. Jessica folded her arms. Can you talk already? David swallowed hard. I think you're very beautiful. Jessica hissed so loudly, birds flew away from a nearby tree. So you've been looking at me all this time, and you can't even talk properly? Please, I beg. And with that, she walked away. David stood there, looking like a lost puppy. His friends? They were on the floor laughing like mad people. Michael wiped his tears. David, what was that? James shook his head. My brother, this was the worst love confession in history. David wanted the ground to swallow him. And that was how his humiliation became complete. For 2 weeks, David vanished from the world like a man who had been kidnapped by his own shame. He stopped attending lectures. He stopped going to the cafeteria. He even stopped replying to messages in the class group chat. If you walked into his hostel room, you would think someone had died. His bed was unmade. His clothes were scattered. His room smelled like someone had been eating biscuits and crying at the same time. David had never felt so embarrassed in his life. How could Jessica hiss at him in public like that? How could his own friends laugh at him when he needed them the most? His pride was broken. His self-esteem was missing. And worst of all, he had no appetite for food, which was a serious problem because normally he ate like a soldier after battle. But now? Even jollof rice didn't excite him. At first, James and Michael enjoyed the drama. David is too dramatic, James said, laughing. It's just one rejection. He's acting like Jessica threw him inside a dustbin. Michael nodded. Exactly. He should get over it. But then, 2 weeks passed, and David was still missing. Even their classmates started asking questions. Where's David? Someone asked. Oh, he's on a heartbreak vacation, James said, laughing. The classmates didn't laugh. Instead, one girl folded her arms and glared at them. You two are bad friends. He's obviously hurt, and you're here, making jokes. James and Michael exchanged awkward glances. For the first time, they started feeling guilty. Maybe we went too far, Michael said later that evening. James sighed. Maybe? We basically turned his heartbreak into a school comedy show. Michael rubbed his face. We need to fix this. And that was when they decided they were going to get David out of his heartbreak hole. That night, James and Michael stormed David's hostel. Bang, bang, bang. They knocked on his door, like policemen on a raid. David, open this door before we break it down. Michael shouted. No response. James frowned. If you don't open it, we will enter by force. Still nothing. Michael turned to James. Do you think he's inside? James sniffed the air. Smell that? Michael nodded. It's the smell of a man who has been eating biscuits and regretting his life. Exactly. He's inside. So James kicked the door lightly. David, if you don't open this door, we will start singing embarrassing love songs outside your room. Still no response. Michael cleared his throat and started singing dramatically. Oh, Jessica Kika, why did you break my friend's heart? The door swung open immediately. David stood there, looking terrible. His eyes were red like someone who had been fighting mosquitoes all night. His hair was rough like a bird's nest. He was wearing the same t-shirt from 2 weeks ago. Michael stepped back in shock. My brother, have you been fighting lions? David sighed and walked back inside. James and Michael followed him, closing the door behind them. David sat on his bed and faced the wall. James and Michael sat beside him. For a few moments, nobody spoke. Then James cleared his throat. David, you can't continue like this. Michael nodded. This is not heartbreak. This is heart destruction. David sighed. You guys don't understand. James raised an eyebrow. Then explain. David turned to face them. Do you know how embarrassing it is for a girl to hiss at you in public? In front of the whole schools? Michael scratched his head. Okay, maybe it was a little embarrassing. James shook his head. No, my brother. It was very embarrassing. David groaned. And instead of helping me, you two laughed like it was the funniest thing in the world. James and Michael exchanged guilty looks. Michael sighed. David, we're sorry. James nodded. We didn't know it affected you this much. Michael placed a hand on David's shoulder. And because we are good friends, we have decided to fix it. David frowned. Fix what? James smirked. Jessica. David sat up immediately. What do you mean? Michael grinned. We're going to make sure Jessica becomes your girlfriend. David blinked. Are you people mad? James smiled. Don't worry. We have a plan. For the next 1 week, James and Michael turned into spies. They studied everything about Jessica. What she liked, what she disliked, who her friends were, what food she enjoyed the most, even the kind of jokes that made her laugh. They gathered information like FBI agents. And when they were finally ready, they called David for a meeting. Michael clapped his hands. Welcome to Operation Get Jessica. David shook his head. I don't like this. James ignored him. First lesson, confidence. Michael stood up. David, when you see Jessica, how do you normally walk? David stood up and walked. Michael burst into laughter. This boy is walking like a chicken with broken legs. James sighed. No wonder she rejected you. You need to walk like a man. For the next 30 minutes, they taught David how to walk with confidence. Then came lesson 2, what to say. James handed David a notebook. We have written down everything Jessica likes. You will study this like an exam. David flipped through the pages. Favorite food? Jollof rice and fried plantain. Favorite musician? Burna Boy. Favorite topic? Books and business. David raised an eyebrow. How did you guys get all this information? Michael smiled. We have connections. James smirked. David, this time, you will not just talk to Jessica. You will impress her. David sighed. I hope you guys know what you're doing. Michael grinned. Trust us. David woke up early that day, feeling a sense of nervous excitement he had never experienced before. It wasn't because it was the day of his final exam or the day he had to present a big project. No. It was because today was the day he was going to talk to Jessica. James and Michael had worked hard over the past week, preparing David for this moment. They had drilled him on everything. They had practiced the walk. They had practiced the talk. Now, all that was left was for David to put everything into action. But the fear in David's heart was still there. He had imagined this moment in his head 1,000 times, but never had he actually faced it. David was terrified. David stared at himself in the mirror. The guy staring back at him wasn't the same shy boy who had walked like a chicken for the past 2 weeks. This was a man, well, almost a man, who had practiced walking with purpose, with confidence, and with a goal. David took a deep breath and looked at himself one last time. You can do this. He stepped outside his hostel room, took one confident step after another, and made his way to the cafeteria where he knew Jessica usually ate. His heart pounded like a drum in his chest. This was it. When he entered the cafeteria, he looked around, scanning for her. Then there she was, Jessica, sitting with a few of her friends at the corner table. She was laughing, her hair flowing around her shoulders like it had its own life. David stood still for a moment, trying to steady himself. Then he remembered what James and Michael had told him. Walk like you own the world. So, David walked up to Jessica, with purpose, with pride. Every step felt like he was walking on a runway, as if he were the star of the show. He reached her table, took a deep breath, and said the words he had practiced. Hi, Jessica. Her friends looked up, but Jessica only raised an eyebrow. She seemed puzzled. Hi, she said, her voice unsure. David stood there for a moment, unsure if this was actually happening. But he remembered the next line James had told him to say. Do you mind if I join you? Jessica shrugged and nodded. Sure, go ahead. David took a seat, trying to act like it was no big deal, but inside, his heart was racing faster than ever. As he sat down, Jessica turned her attention to him more fully, studying him with curiosity. It was clear she hadn't expected this. David smiled and began, "I was thinking, we never really talked much, but we seem to have some things in common." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "Oh, really?" David nodded, feeling the confidence growing in his voice. "For example, I heard you like jollof rice with fried plantain." "I do too." Jessica seemed surprised but smiled a little. "You like jollof rice too?" David nodded, his nerves now slowly fading. "Yeah, and I hear you like Burna Boy." Her eyes widened slightly. "How do you know that?" David smiled. "I've done my homework." Jessica laughed. "I thought I was the only one who loved his music." This was David's moment. He had broken the ice, and now the conversation started flowing easily. They talked about music, food, and books, things that David had learned about Jessica over the past week. She seemed to enjoy his company, and that gave him even more courage. David couldn't believe how well this was going. It was as though everything his friends had taught him had worked. As the conversation went on, David could feel the connection building between them. Jessica laughed at his jokes, and even caught her flashing him a genuine smile. But David's ultimate goal had always been to make Jessica notice him as more than just another guy in the crowd. So, when the conversation started to die down, David cleared his throat and decided it was time. "Jessica," he said, his voice low and serious, "I know this might sound crazy, but I really like you. I mean, I've always admired you from afar, but I never had the courage to talk to you until today." Jessica blinked, surprised by the sudden honesty. "Really?" David nodded, feeling a rush of emotion. "Yeah. And I've been kind of shy, but after everything that's happened recently, I figured that I shouldn't hold back anymore." Jessica's expression softened. "I had no idea you felt that way." David smiled, his heart now full of hope. "Well, now you do." There was a long pause as Jessica stared at him. David's heart was racing again, but this time, it wasn't from fear. It was from anticipation. Then, Jessica smiled. "You know what, David? You've got guts. I admire that." David's face lit up with relief. "So, does this mean we can hang out more? Maybe grab some jollof rice?" Jessica laughed and nodded. "I think I'd like that." The next few days were a blur for David. It was like he was walking on air. The shy, insecure guy who once avoided eye contact with girls was now walking around campus, talking to Jessica like they were old friends. The best part? They had become good friends, and the more they hung out, the more David realized that this wasn't just a crush. He actually liked her, really liked her. And the most surprising thing? Jessica seemed to like him back. A year later, David and Jessica were officially a couple. They had gone through the ups and downs of university life, always supporting each other. They graduated together, and a few years after that, they tied the knot. It was one of those love stories that people look back on and say, "I knew it from the beginning." And years later, David still couldn't stop thanking his friends, James and Michael, for all the help. One evening, as they sat at their home with their kids, David turned to his friends, who were visiting. "You guys know if it wasn't for you, I'd still be shy, lost, and single." James laughed. "We told you we had your back." Michael raised his glass. "Here's to the best love story ever told, and the best friends who made it happen." They all toasted, laughing and reminiscing about the crazy days when David was just a shy, awkward boy. And as David looked at Jessica across the room, his heart swelled with gratitude. He'd come a long way from the nervous boy he once was. Now he was a happy man, with the love of his life by his side. That brings us to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed the story. Thanks for watching.